I will be putting the Eslin Code of Conduct in the chat. Also, towards the end of the event, I will have a link to an evaluation and to a certificate form. So watch for those if you want either a certificate, and we'd love to get your feedback. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Gundrum, the Executive Director at CDLC, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you for making all the arrangements. Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm the director at CELC, Capital District Library Council, one of the 9 councils representing the Empire State Library Network. This is an ESLN sponsored webinar, as Susan said, and it came out of a ESLN Academic Director Advisory Group. A small group of academic library directors have been meeting over the past several years to talk about academic libraries specifically and what their needs are. And we've talked quite a bit about data and how to use data to convince your relevance to your administration, for lack of a really quick summary. So this is really timely for us. And when Mark casually mentioned to me that he'd be happy to speak about it, I said, okay, when are you available? So I'm really pleased to welcome Mark. The group that I mentioned, the Eslin Academic Library Group, will be planning a symposium. We hope to have an in-person academic director symposium about a year from now, or maybe even sooner. We haven't even had our first planning meeting yet, so it's in the very early stages. I'm mentioning this because today, when you hear from Mark, if there are certain topics that really pique your interest or that you think we should take a deeper dive into, whether it's at the symposium or at another Eslin webinar, please let me know, let your local library council director know, and we'll pass it on to the planning committee. So that being said, again, I'm so happy to welcome Mark here. Mark and I go back a ways. When he was at SUNY System Administration, he's now obviously at Ithaka S+R, and we do stay in touch and compare notes about the current status of academic libraries. So thank you, Mark, for being here, and I'll turn it right over to you. And thank you to all of you for being here.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Kathy said, I'm Mark McBride. I'm an Ithaka S+R. I'm the Senior Director for the Academic Mission. So today I'm going to be presenting in the most recent cycle of the Library Deans and Directors Survey. It's the U.S. Library Survey. And so what I can say is, looking at the evidence this year, what came across pretty clear is that we are seeing that values in libraries are certainly durable, but the constraints are for real. And the gap between whether strategy has caught up to the overall reality of the role in academic missions today is still up for debate. So during the presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight a lot of the value recognition and some of the strategy and the AI readiness, because you can't do a presentation without talking about AI anymore. And then also the staffing priorities and the budgets and a lot of the issues around library collections. Also, during the presentation, I'm going to layer in another study we did on library relationships and the publishing community, which I think is aligned a lot with some of the evidence we found in the results around library collections in this cycle of the survey. So what I'll do is just give you all a brief snapshot of what Ithaka S+R is. We're a research organization. We focus on collaboration, innovation in higher education. Our work informs policy and also strategy in higher ed. Ithaka is part of the larger organization, Ithaka, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, famous for bringing the world of libraries, JSTOR. And our overall mission is really what drives us as an organization. We're a non-for-profit organization. We're most focused on improving access to knowledge and education worldwide. Now, our first cycle of this survey began in 2010, and we run this on a triannual basis. We did an off year during the pandemic just because it was such a unique phenomena. We wanted to get evidence from the library leadership community about how they were reacting to the changes brought on by the pandemic. But for the most part, we share these findings every 3 years as this survey has become kind of a pillar within the sphere of academic libraries. So I'm going to give you a little background on this particular survey. Like I said, it's every three years we track the perspectives and the priorities of library leaders, and we track over time how their strategies change in terms of those priorities and those perspectives. So this cycle, which we administered in 2025, includes some long-standing topics. So there's some questions that play out every year. This is an attempt we have to collect some longitudinal data, but also some of the emerging challenges, especially around the role of the library, strategy, collections, and of course, budgets. This report in particular contains more findings than just what's covered in this presentation today. So I curated a selection of findings that I think would most relevant based on the conversation Kathy and I had over lunch. Let me touch a little bit here on the methodology to kind of ground you all in the survey. So this cycle was fielded to the library deans and directors at four-year institutions, not-for-profit colleges and universities in the US. And this is the breakdown of the responses. So these are the people that responded and their demographic makeup. We again combined a lot of legacy questions for some cross-cycle comparison, and we layered in a bunch of new questions as well. The final sample ended up being 483 responses with 36% response rate, which is really good for a national survey. And of that response rate, 38% came from doctoral institutions, 53% came from private not-for-profit institutions, and 57% have been in their current role as a library leader for 5 years or fewer. I'm going to touch on some of the key findings, and then we're going to drill down on some of those key findings as I get through the presentation. So I think the big glaring one for me is that financial and staffing constraints continue to strain libraries. Now, this has been going on for a number of years, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. A decline in open access prioritization appeared in this cycle of the survey, which somewhat surprised us, but I think it's understandable with some of the financial constraints. We'll get into that a little bit later. AI is certainly reshaping library priorities. Now, adoption is still a little uneven, but most libraries agreed, and most librarians library leaders, I should say, agreed that the AI is going to be a focus of the future of their library and their strategies. Although they still feel undervalued in terms of campus decision-making at the highest levels of the organization. So constraints certainly are impacting their strategy, their staffing, their collections, as well as their campus influence. So in this presentation, I'm going to move around from the library role and strategy into things like AI, hiring, budgets, and also into collections. So I'm going to get into the questions right now. So the first set, we asked the leaders themselves about the role of the library. And one of the big takeaways here is that while most libraries leaders feel really confident in their ability to articulate the value of their library, fewer believe that this value is actually recognized by senior administrators. So 75% of respondents in this cycle were confident in their ability to articulate the library's overall value proposition in a way that aligns with the strategic goals of their institution. And that's up from 72% in 2022. 57% of the respondents, feel that the direct supervisor and them, whoever they report to, if it's their provost or some another VP on campus, they share a similar vision. They share the same vision for the library. And that's up from 2019, where 55% responded in that way. What seems to hold across the last few cycles is 51% reported confidence that academic deans and other senior administrators believe the library's value proposition aligns with the strategic goals of the college and the university. That remains unchanged over time. So while the library leaders themselves are very confident in their ability to set a strategy for the organization, they're unsure if that strategy actually aligns with what their peers are envisioning is the strategy for the library. In this cycle, also 63% say faculty and researchers across the board recognize the library's value, and 31% reported involvement in key institutional decision making, meaning they felt that their senior administration approached them with key decisions that are being made at the highest levels of the institution. They also felt that senior administrators, or 24% of the respondents felt that senior administrators consider the library's role and the library leader's role to be equivalent standing to other peers. So what this signals to me is that it's not necessarily just a communications issue. It seems to be about the library's position or the library leader's position, their authority, and maybe their influence on campus as well as priorities are changing across higher ed. We continue on the role of the library. And library leaders reported a strong commitment to their core values, which is pretty fascinating here. To see a 97% agreement across the board in any survey is quite unique. You typically don't get numbers at that level, but library leaders did report that they felt a strong commitment to what those core values are of the library. And a large majority also say that the mission remains consistent despite any social political changes, and 90% feel confident advocating for their library to senior administration, even outside the campus. But at the same time, strategies have shifted. Only 31%, in fact, agree that the library strategies are the same as they were 3 years ago. So the libraries, although they feel confident in their commitment to their core values, their strategies are always evolving and always changing. Well, 62% somewhat disagree that their library strategy actually fluctuated between the last cycle of the research. So library value definitely endures, but the way libraries pursue those values, they're beginning to change. They're beginning to shift. Back to the role of the library. So when we ask library leaders to identify the functions that they most strongly prioritize, it shows that in this chart that the top 10 functions seem to be more focused on student-facing type of activities. So 98% listed student research, critical analysis, and information literacy is sitting at the top of one of the strategies within the libraries. Resource negotiation, contract negotiations and access, instruction, and let's say third space functions in terms of the library space itself, research support, preservation, and AI literacy also appeared in those top functions. So what this says to me is that libraries are balancing long-standing responsibilities, such as information literacy and support for student research, with some emerging instructional needs, as well as some emerging research needs, especially around AI and AI literacy. So I'm going to wrap up this section here on the role of the library. So libraries still see their role as providing trusted and credible resources is important. With information literacy, again, and credibility is central to the library identity. Nearly all respondents rate acting as a trusted, credible source of information is highly important, and 98%, in fact, responded that in that way. Promoting critical thinking and information literacy is almost as high at 97%. So countering disinformation and providing access to restricted and difficult to obtain information was at 86%. So looking at that through line right now, you can see that trusted, credible resources, critical thinking, information literacy, encountering disinformation, all responses were above 80% or 85% from the library leaders. Fewer responded that they felt the library was a politically neutral space and that the library's civic role was as important. And only 51% actually felt that the library was actually a politically neutral space. Now, that can be somewhat a complex and contested topic of discussion in academic libraries, but I actually think it's an important one as we move forward that academic libraries are going to need to have. I'm going to move into the library strategy next, unless there's any questions.
Yeah, there is one question from Scott. Library leaders are confident they can articulate their value, yet only 31% are involved in key institutional decisions, and only 24% are viewed as equivalent to other senior leaders. Does this suggest that the problem is no longer how libraries communicate their value, but how institutions position library leadership?
That's a good question because this is like one of those paradoxes in the survey. So the library leaders indicate like a strong level of confidence in their ability to articulate the vision of the library, yet that's not translating with senior leadership. I think that this requires probably further analysis, and I don't know if this is something that can be tackled necessarily in a survey. And I'm hesitant to say definitively what exactly this means, but obviously there is some sort of a gap between what is being communicated, and what is being interpreted by senior leadership. And I think that is probably going to be down into the local library, like almost a local campus level. Like, what is your relationship with your senior leaders? We did a study years ago with ARL and Carl, the Canadian research library community, where we interviewed senior research officers, presidents, provosts, about their perspective of the library and library leadership. And it showed that there was definitely a disconnect in terms of what the library was articulating as their value and what senior leadership felt that they needed from the library. And I think that this tells me that disconnect between what the library believes their role is and what senior leadership want their role to be may be at odds with each other. It doesn't mean that senior leadership is correct. What it means, though, is that there's this need for a translation with senior leadership and with the library leaders and the library itself.
Great. I think that's the only question we have right now.
Okay, I'm going to move on to library strategy. And so if you look here, this set of questions is strictly on the strategy within the library, and it helps us to understand what library leaders are thinking about in terms of developing and implementing their strategy. So we see areas identified by either highly important or appear to be supported by the same level of strategy. So looking at 59% indicated that the library has a clear collection strategy that drives decision-making about format, delivery, and access. So that's up from 53% in 2022 and 52% in 2019, which tells me that libraries are starting to develop a clear understanding of what their collection strategy is. 43% indicated that the library has a clear vision that is broadly accepted on campus for the use of their space footprint. So this is a physical space question. And that's up 1 or 2% from 2022, and about the same from 2019. While only 13% believe that their library has a clear vision for addressing the influence of dis or misinformation among their community members, and that's down from 2022, where 17% responded that they had a clear vision. This kind of makes sense right now because I think the country is in a political quagmire, if you would. So I could feel that the tension is probably real, not only inside academic library. It's probably the same in public libraries. It's just like everywhere else. The political tensions are just fraught. In the same question, 10% responded that the library has a clear vision for future proofing. And this takes into account emerging social political trends as well. Now that's down from 17% in 2022. So as the library starts to think about how they prepare themselves for the future, they feel less confident that they actually have like a clear strategy for that, which somewhat is understandable as you're starting to work through these budget constraints, as well as the human resource capacity issues that libraries are facing. So what we're seeing is that there's this clear need for some more formal understanding of what the values and needs are of the library and translating that, not only that externally, but also internally. But formal planning is still a little bit uneven. The other part of the library strategy question was like indicating their level of agreement with some of these statements below. So if you look at this, this is interesting that 78% of library leaders agree that they have a responsibility to strengthen public trust and reliable information sources. Again, information literacy and critical thinking rises high again in responses. 72% said that the library should prepare for emerging technologies to reshape information literacy needs. And 70% are confident that their staff have the skills needed to teach information literacy effectively. Only 65% say the library is recognized as an information literacy leader on campus. So what this tells me is that the leaders see the direction of change is very important with information literacy, and the strategy has maybe not entirely caught up with the rest of the campus. So I'll pause if there's any questions about library strategy, and then I'm going to move into AI in the library.
There isn't a question, but there is a comment that says, maybe we need a conference in which library leaders and senior academic leaders can discuss the 2 Ithaka S+R surveys and share perspectives.
I think that's a great idea. We would be happy to host that meeting.
We have that on the recording.
There you go. There is. I mean, I think there has been this tension that has played out over years, where there seems to be some sort of gap between what senior leadership and the rest of the campus community might understand as the role of the library and what role the library is that they feel they play. And how that gets translated between, let's say, the dean of the library, the director of the library, and then their executive leader, I think is still somewhat invisible. When we talk to many executive leaders, when they talk about their library, they say nice things. So we don't hear like an outright criticism. But when we talk to library leaders, they tell us that translating their strategy to their senior leaders is much more difficult than it has been in the past.
And there's one more question. How much of the pressure reflected in these findings, particularly around budgets, staffing, student success, and institutional standing, can be attributed to declining enrollment at respondents' home institutions? Were you able to compare the responses with institutional enrollment trends? Good question.
So that's a great question. So we did not look in terms of institutional enrollment trends because we don't collect information on individual institutions. Later on, you'll see that we did break things up regionally, and for the most part, this held these findings across the country. There was no noticeable difference in the findings, except for in areas where we talk about library budgets. There's a small difference in response rates from the South versus the rest of the country, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It was somewhat interesting. So now we'll move on to AI in the library, and I think AI is certainly an opportunity for libraries to step up and provide leadership. And it'd be interesting to see if libraries see that role in themselves as well. So what we did see is that library leaders certainly expect AI to affect every part of the library work. They don't see AI not having a direct impact. Now, this space is changing fast, so that number may change over time. But only 1% said, and this is out of over 350 some respondents, only 1% believe that AI would not affect their library within the next 3 years. So the question is not whether AI matters, but how libraries are responding right now. So the leading anticipated impact is increased demand for AI literacy. So again, information literacy shows up in the responses, if you will. 83%, in fact, responded that AI literacy instruction is going to be where they're going to see the biggest impact. Integration of AI tools in discovery systems was also high at 74%. And then more than half expect staff changes or reskilling needs, and roughly half expect heightened scrutiny of research integrity in AI-powered services as having some of the biggest impact. I'd like to unpack a little bit of the research integrity one. I think this is a huge issue. And I know it's one that publishers are struggling to respond to. It's probably it's a problem that has several solutions. We do have a study coming out here shortly, the researcher study. It's a survey we did of researchers in the U.S. And although the publication is out, I can give you one quick snapshot of it. AI usage by researchers was much higher than what they declared. So a number of publishers are requesting that researchers declare use of AI, and usage, according to those declarations, seem very low. But when we talk to the research community, it seems that researchers are using AI in their research. How they're using it, I don't know, but they're using it somehow. So that is certainly going to start to, cause questions in some of the integrity of the research.
Oh, and we do have a question about whether the PowerPoint will be made accessible online, so we can refer back to it. And I am happy to post it if you share the slides with me.
Happy to.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So the other thing we found is that AI adoption is pretty uneven across library functions. So libraries certainly are integrating AI tools in a variety of different ways, but it doesn't seem to just point directly into one area. So current use is most common in discovery, About 40% responded that discovery is where they're seeing the most integration of AI, followed by support services for research, which is a response rate of 29%. And 26% said they're using it for internal data analysis, which I thought was interesting. And then 22% are using it for metadata creation and validation. That I think is going to grow over time. Of note, though, 24% report not using AI tools for internal library work or services. That means a quarter just are not using AI at all for any of their internal work. So there's this what I would say this phenomenon of AI that's impacting libraries, and I think the strategy is still in development. And we're going to move forward next and start talking about why some libraries are not adopting AI, which I think is some interesting findings. So this slide explains exactly why libraries are not using AI tools. And among libraries not currently using AI, the leading barrier is low priority relative to other library strategies. So 50% of respondents don't think AI aligns right now with their current strategy. I think staff skills, time, and capacity, as well as ethical or moral opposition, all seem to be close behind as well. I think the moral opposition piece is interesting and will be important to track over time because I think there's a lot of skepticism of AI. We had colleagues present these findings in Europe, and it was interesting that at the European conference, the skepticism of AI wasn't as prominent as we see here in the U.S. But also it wasn't like the number one item that they talked about. Some of the hesitancy with AI also results from financial resources. People just don't have the funding right now to spend to buy any AI technology. Staff buy-in, there's some pushback from staff. Again, there's environmental concerns that I think we're all becoming more familiar with. And then there's uncertainty about where to begin. Like AI is here, where do we begin with AI? And that's something that we're hearing loud and clear in a project we have right now. It's a cohort-based project called AI for Action, where we're working with libraries to see where they're implementing AI into their operational activities. So the main takeaway is that AI adoption is constrained not only by strategy, but also by capacity, skills, and values. And I also say it's not just a technology issue. I think a lot of people think access to the technology might be one of the biggest issues. It appears to be more cultural than anything else. I'm going to move into hiring priorities, and I'm about halfway through the slide, so I may start picking up the pace here just a little bit. So as we start looking at hiring priorities, I think this slide shows that staffing expectations align with like some of the emerging needs and some of the resource constraints. So the largest expected area of growth with staff is with AI and machine learning. In fact, 31% believe that there could be some growth in hiring. And other growth areas include instruction and information literacy, assessment and analytics, student success, open access or OER support. It's a little lower than we anticipated. Frontline services and research data management. So there are some expected reductions that are most visible in those frontline services and technical services, and I'm going to start talking about that in the next slide. So as we start looking at some of the staffing additions we expect to see, AI and machine learning, of course, remain top priority, along with information literacy and student success and engagement. I do want to point out, though, there is the selective hiring growth where libraries appear to be prioritizing roles tied to AI, instruction, analytics, and research support. But when you look at like some of the decrease where they're expecting a reduction in employee, it's allocating staff away from those traditional frontline technical services and collection roles towards more of those AI instruction and analytical roles. The largest anticipated reduction for 2025 were frontline services at 19%. Technical services were at 17%. Collection development, subject specialists, or even department liaisons was at 13%. Where they also indicated a 7% reduction were instruction and information literacy services are present, but which is interesting because this is an area where they think their strategy is most important. Rare materials and special collections also saw a small reduction, and then all the other remaining areas were below 4%. And so I don't think we need to focus on any of those right now. So does anybody want to ask any questions about hiring before I move into budgets?
Let's see, I don't see any questions. If you are typing now, we can always come back to them if one pops up while you're talking.
Okay. So,
And we do have, this is scheduled until 4 o'clock, so you have plenty of time.
oh, wonderful. Okay, good. All right. So now we're going to talk about library budgets. And library operating budgets, as you can see here, they're heavily dependent on college or university operating funds. That actually accounts for about 77% of current operating budgets. Other sources for funding, although they're much smaller, are state or federal appropriations, endowments at about 6%. Some libraries reported student fees at 4%, and contributed support at 3%. So that's single donations or possible Friends of the Library program that I know some universities have stood up. Now, budget expectations are split almost evenly, and I think this is worth unpacking a little bit. So 32% expect increases. So I would love to be in the 32% group. And then another 32% expect decreases, while 36% expect more stability. This is where we saw that disparity regionally. So libraries in the South were more likely to expect a decreased operating budget in the future. And that kind of surprised us because if you look at enrollment trends down South, there are actually growth campuses in the South. If you look at a place like Texas, enrollments are booming. You look at Florida, enrollments are booming, but yet they expect a decrease in operating budgets. Looking more into budgets, this highlights what some of that budget pressure looks like in operational decisions. Budget pressure, of course, affects both collections and services in tandem, and it certainly impacts capacity. So among respondents anticipating budget decreases, 84% have implemented either reduced subscription spending, 71% have reduced staff, or just have not filled vacant lines. A number of libraries have actually started renegotiating their vendor contracts, maybe cutting travel or professional development funding for staff. Increased reliance on student workers is becoming more prevalent, and reducing hours has also now become a pretty common trend. Some changes are still more often considered than actually implemented, especially applying for more grants and partnering with campus units to share costs. We hear a lot of that, but we haven't seen many examples of that. I think the one thing we're hearing from the community themselves, where library hours are concerned, that there is some pushback that has come from student populations in the past. I don't know if they're still hearing that same level of pushback from students. I'd be interested to know what this group thinks. I don't know if people reduce their hours and hear a lot of, let's say, concerns coming from students when they do reduce the hours. This is a question that we've asked starting in, I think it was 2022 is the first time we asked this. We wanted to layer in a hypothetical, what would you do if you had a 10% increase in your budget? So, we asked library leaders to just stop, reflect. If you had a 10% increase, what would that look like? Where would you make the investment? And the top investment is in new employees or redefined positions. So 48% responded that they would either redefine positions, hire new employees, or 39% said they would actually move to salary increases for current staff. Leaders would also invest in things like online or digital journals and databases, facilities, technology infrastructure, and professional development. So, compared with the earlier cycle, technology and professional development appear more prominent in 2025 than it did in 2022. And so, what this shows to us is that capacity building with additional funds and additional funds, if they had them, would go towards the people. It would go towards the infrastructure. It would go into core access. And now we ask the inverse of this question as well. Like, where would you make the cuts if you had a 10% decrease? This is the one the publishers detest us reporting on. Now, the leading reduction target, if there was a reduction in the overall budget, is in online or digital journals. So a cut in databases or a cut in journal subscriptions. Print monographs, print journals, ebooks, travel, professional development, facilities, new positions, that all shows up as a reduction target. That seems very familiar probably to people. I think what's important to focus on here is that digital resources, they're no longer protected from cuts. They are now the most commonly selected area for reduction. And this connects directly to the next group of slides that I'm going to do, that I'm going to present on. And this has to do with another study, which I think is in parallel to some of these findings about the relationship that libraries have with academic publishers. But before I move into that section, Susan, I'm wondering if there's any questions.
There is only one comment which says the student feedback about ours is much quieter than it used to be.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you. So we did a study at the beginning of 2025. We were contracted by Emerald Publishing to do a research study just in general on perception of academic publishers from the library community. They wanted to know, what does the library community think about publishers in general? So I'm going to connect some of those findings to some of the collection and budget findings that were in the previous slides. Okay. So it shows that low usage is most widely the cited reason for a reduction in let's say academic publisher content or reduction in the overall collection. Insufficient budgeting and funding was still high at 93%, but usage was at the highest at 98%. Redundancy, program closures, or changes in misalignment with institutional content needs are also major factors when you see a reduction in overall collection management inside the library. And I want to highlight something in particular, that decisions with collections, they seem to be sitting at the intersection of both usage and the evidence of that usage, institutional priorities. So it could shift if an academic program closes, or let's say one comes up online, and of course, overall budget pressure. We also asked what library leaders value when beginning or renewing publisher contracts. So when they go to renew a contract, what is it that they're actually looking for? And the strongest value areas include accessible formats. That doesn't surprise me because I think accessibility was at the top of everybody's mind in 2025 and certainly in 2026. Combating disinformation was another top priority. Misinformation, of course. Advancing open access remained high. And then just general access to knowledge, an opposition to censorship, support of academic research, academic freedom was also fairly high. Leaders also value publisher advocacy for library supportive policies, practical real world impact, representation of unrepresented scholars. So they want to see diversity in the scholars who get published in their journals. Also, environmental responsibility appeared as a top issue that libraries think about when they enter into renegotiations with publishers, as well as just global publishing inclusion. So that takeaway for me is that the collection decisions are not only about cost and usage, but they also reflect institutional and professional values. So when a library is negotiating with a publisher or an aggregator, they want to make sure that whoever that publisher or aggregator is, that they're in lockstep with the values of the institution themselves. Now, this slide to me is interesting. So let me just unpack it a little bit, okay? So if you look to the left, the values closer to 1, they align to more of a negative descriptor. And if you look to the right, values closer to 7, they align with more of a positive descriptor. And of course, 4 right in the middle is this more neutral. So what we ask respondents is a set of questions in which they are given 2 opposing descriptors on either side of a continuum, and asking them to indicate where their perception of academic publishers falls on this continuum here. So respondents see publishers as central to library operations. You can see that at the bottom. An average score of 5.4. So libraries do see that publishers are critical to what they do, but at the same time, average perceptions are below neutral or near neutral on exploitive or supportive or adversarial, aligned, non-transparent versus transparent, and one-sided versus mutually beneficial. So if you look at this, what this tells us is that, while the publisher and the publishing industry is critical to the library, there's still tension in the overall relationship. And this tells us that maybe libraries and publishers are at an intersection where the relationship needs to become more important than the actual cost of the content themselves. So I'm moving back into the presentation itself from the library director's survey, and just looking at some of the responses around collections. So open access definitely had a decline in terms of a priority. So it shows that from 2022 to 2025, open access is not necessarily as much of a priority as it once was for libraries. Now, this could just be a blip on the screen because over many cycles, open access has always increased. This is the first cycle we actually saw a decrease. Reading access to journals not available through open access remains the highest item. but it fell from 84% to 74%. In guidance on publication venues, transformative agreements, transition planning, strategic contributions, and APC subsidies all declined even more sharply. So this does indicate that open access, while it still matters to the library, I think leaders are prioritizing it less intensely as they did in previous cycles. Now, again, this could be a direct result of just changes in budgets. And also, I think an increased understanding that maybe open access doesn't necessarily lead to a decrease in expenditures. There's also general decline in confidence with open access as it relates to institutional spending. So fewer respondents actually expect that open access will decrease costs in the future. And I think there's a bunch of indications out there that open access costs nearly about the same as traditional scholarship. And I think when you saw that reduction in federal funding to federal grants, a lot of those transformative agreements, they really took a hit, because I think there was this theory of change that researchers would use some of that federal funding to cover some of the APC costs. And I think we're realizing now, with the reduction in general funding, researchers aren't going to be so readily available to share that funding for anything beyond their research. Expectations, increased costs remain fairly similar, 39% in 2025 and 41% in 2022. The share expecting neither increase nor decrease in total funding towards open access. It rose from 33 to 42%. So open access, it seems to be softening as a priority. And the cost savings narrative seems to be less convincing to people moving into the future. So there is a slight variation in preferred acquisition adoption by institutional type. So doctoral institutions are most likely to report adopting an e-preferred acquisition model. 64% responded in favor of that model. And adoption is much lower among master's institutions or special focus institutions, and also baccalaureate institutions. Non-adoption is highest among BA institutions, with 63% saying that their collection strategy varied by that institutional context and by their overall capacity. So what this tells me is that while doctoral institutions are moving into a more e-preferred model of acquisition, it hasn't necessarily took in other sectors in higher education. So this is also coming into more the collections area. So ebook acquisition is widespread, but purchasing methods remain relatively traditional. So ebook acquisition, I think, is nearly universal. I think it has been for a while. 96% of libraries reporting that that they acquire ebooks on a regular basis. Among those libraries, traditional item-by-item selection remains the leading method. 42% of libraries are still doing that item-by-item selection. Demand-driven acquisition, or EBA, is also important, but things like flip to open and complete collections are less commonly rated highly valuable or important to libraries. So this essentially closes the collections section, and it shows that digital acquisition is now, of course, mainstream, but acquisition models are still evolving, and I think it will be interesting to see how those acquisition models evolve over time. What really surprised me in this is that we're still doing item by item selection for collection management. DDA and EBA still hasn't become as prevalent as I would have expected by now. But of course, that is likely going to change even more over time. So some of the key takeaways, leaders can articulate their value, but they are certainly less certain that the institution really recognizes that their value or what their impact is. Say core values are mostly stable, so that the traditional core identity of the library seems to be still seems to be held important, and it's probably the nucleus of the strategy for most libraries. Um, but the strategies in general are changing as they respond to some of the technical, changes that are taking place with AI and other systems. And of course, budgetary pressures, I think, are informing nearly everything. AI is increasing expectations for instruction for different services, and many libraries have yet to really translate what that means in terms of like a coordinated strategy. That's not unique. I think you see that across higher ed. I think AI strategy itself is still in development. But I think constrained budgets are affecting and impacting services. They're impacting collections, and I think it's just adding increased pressure in terms of the overall strategy for libraries. And so that's why we named this cycle Under Pressure, because it obviously articulated that libraries right now are certainly under pressure. I see some comments and some questions, Susan.
Oh, the comments were mostly from me, telling
Okay.
people to fill out their survey and get their attendance certificate. But there was a comment from somebody saying that the students were mainly concerned about library access and not as much about staff contact hours. So they reduced the contact hours to 40 hours a week while keeping the building open 24/7, and no students complained. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
All right.
I don't know if people have any other questions. You can put them in the chat or Q&A, or we're a small enough group. If you want to raise your hand, I can let you talk if you would like to do it that way. Give people a few minutes to type anything out. But meanwhile, also in the chat, there is a link for an attendance certificate and for an evaluation as well. But here, I'll let you go on to your future work.
All right, thanks. So based on the findings from this survey and findings from some other work that we're involved in, we've started standing up a number of different cohort projects. I mentioned the AI in action that's working with libraries in like a community of practice to help them think through how they're going to implement AI into their operations. AI literacy is becoming top of mind. It still remains top of mind for every institution. And it was interesting that when AI first said everybody wanted an AI literacy strategy, and now it seems like people are looking for an AI workforce strategy. So we're at the AI literacy phase still, working with libraries, but we're also starting to have conversations with some funders about AI and workforce readiness. We're also looking at AI ready assessment, especially when it comes to teaching faculty. I think learning assessment in the classroom is completely in jeopardy right now with AI. I think faculty are all feeling that pressure. We're also looking at a study that would look at the AI ready library graduate students. So at the beginning of the year, my colleagues and I traveled to Scotland for the iSchool conference, where it was mostly iSchool faculty and deans that did the presenting, and the reaction to AI from their perspective was much different than you would see boots on the ground in an academic campus library. So we're wondering if that translates to what the graduate students are actually learning. So what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing so that we can maybe move to Q&A.
Oh, there's another question. Are library leaders perhaps overestimating their ability to articulate value, particularly if that articulation is not producing recognition, influence, or involvement in institutional decisions?
Um, well, I imagine that's case by case basis, right? I imagine that's probably true for a number of library leaders. And I imagine, it's the inverse is true. There could be some executive leadership on the campus that they feel out of lockstep with what their strategy is in terms of what the campus need is. But I think for a number of years, libraries have struggled to regain their footing. And I don't think it's just unique to libraries. I think AI is really putting a significant challenge in post-secondary learning, but also just in institutions in general. And I think this could be an opportunity for libraries to step up and provide that leadership. I remember when we first started developing websites in higher education, it was the libraries often who led the way by putting the first websites and making content available digitally, much to the consternation of many faculty, including humanities faculty. But at the same time, now we see that ebook and just e-acquisition in general is the norm. And with AI, it could be the time for libraries as information scientists, to step up and lead in this time as well. Now, the trade-off is, what are libraries going to put down? And I think that's the biggest question to ask the library community. As you look across your organizations, what is it that you do on a day-to-day basis that you can actually stop doing? And those are not easy questions to ask, and they're even more difficult questions to answer because trying to put something down requires a level of not only leadership, but it also requires a level of alignment across the organization. Like that can't be a top-down mandate. That almost has to be a top-down, bottom-up agreement of accountability. And I think that's a real struggle because higher ed is under intense pressure right now, for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's a good comment about that in the chat about libraries being in a sandwich generation where we're tending on to the old services and collections that are dying and also trying to gear up for the new ones. So, and then we have another question here. Did the survey probe what the demographic cliff in higher education means to library leaders in terms of budgeting and even consistent stream of student workers? The cliff is deemed a long and protracted decline in traditional college-age freshmen.
So we didn't survey on the enrollment cliff, and I don't think we can necessarily draw complete conclusions from the findings about the impact of the enrollment cliff. However, I think we could look at library budgets once again, taking another round of cuts. I think you could see, especially I think it started a number of years ago, but it became really prevalent in 2024 and 2025. There were a lot of organizations that went through significant staff reductions, and I think you're going to start seeing more staff reductions, over time, and that doesn't impact just the library, but I think that's in response to the enrollment cliff. And therefore, I think the long tail of that, of course, impacts libraries. So while we didn't necessarily, analyze based on just the enrollment cliff, I think we can infer from some of the findings that the enrollment cliff certainly has an impact on some of the budget and staffing constraints that libraries are feeling.
And I apologize. I know I told you we had this book till 4, but I was wrong. We have it booked till 3:30. But I know if you're
Oh,
willing to stay here, um, I'm willing to stay here. We have another, but anyone that needs to leave, we will send out the recording, including the part that goes after 3:30, out to you all next week sometime. And we do have another comment about AI. The jury is still out on AI because as return on investment is demanded on the investment in AI companies, fees for use are going to rise. I'm not convinced that institutions and users will be willing to fork over money for many of these tools.
Yeah, I think that is yet to be seen. I think you know AI is an interesting technology. It's you know I use AI in a couple of administrative tasks that I'm involved in. But in terms of like intellectual work, I don't think it's very good. We don't use it in analyzing our data at S+R. We kind of made that clear to ourselves that we didn't want to use the AI technology to analyze our qualitative or quantitative data. Not just because the jury is still out, but right now we're a little unsure what that would translate to our community if we're using AI to analyze data. But I actually think, AI is I mean, the Pope wrote an entire encyclical on it, right? And so, when you get an encyclical from the Pope, whether you're aligned with the Catholic organization or not, people sit up and pay attention. I also think, we have to be honest, like some of the players in the AI space, they take to a microphone. They're not very good salespeople, yet they seem to be pushing that technology on all of us, and it's going to, take away our jobs and whatnot. And I think it's probably not going to have the impact that is being maybe pronounced by the AI companies, but I do think AI is likely going to be a technology that somehow holds over time. It reminds me of actually at the beginning of the internet. I just think this is a new age, and AI is here. And I still think libraries have a key role in helping to translate the good, the bad, and the ugly for the communities that they serve. I think that's at the core of what we do.
Thank you. And we have thanks in the chat to you as well for sharing all this information. As I said, I will be passing out the slides and the recording sometime next week. If there's any further questions, people can put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Kathy. Or maybe I will. Kathy, we can't hear you. I know you're not muted, so I don't know what's going on. Well, on behalf of CDLC and Kathy Gundrum, I want to thank Mark and thank you all for coming today. And we hope to see you at a future ESLN or CDLC event.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.